So another thing that I'd love to hear from the group is, are there things that you've seen other cities doing that you would really like to participate in or hear more about? I know, Nashville has done a lot of interesting things around procurement and collaborative purchasing. So does anyone have anything, or even just ideas? It doesn't have to be something you know the details on, but does anyone have any collaborative things that they'd like to talk about? Maybe you can tell the group a little bit more about what you were doing in Nashville.
Well, Yahweh is actually the person who has the details on it. But basically, I think we have the same struggles many of you other cities have, where we have entrepreneurial companies who are very interested in providing service to us, but they can't reach the threshold that it takes to do business just with us, because it does take an investment in time, an investment in effort on their part, and most small companies, I don't know about the rest of you cities, but most small companies don't have the time or patience to go through the processes that we put them through, which is part of the reason we're here discussing. So what Yahweh's initiative was, which was successful as far as I'm concerned, was to see how we could promote both getting apps developed for us by these small companies, but at the same time solve some of the same problems all these cities across the country have. Everybody has the need for a fix the pothole by taking a picture of it and zipping the GPS coordinates off app. So the thought is that we could work together with these other cities to provide a mechanism whereby we could sneak in under kind of the authorization thresholds, whereby which we would have to go out to an RFP, and in my case, that's $10,000. So if anything is over $10,000, we've got to go to RFP if we can't find another government agency in Tennessee or a WISCA type contract to jump on. We have to go to RFP. So the initiative was that for $5,000 each, these 4 cities would offer incentives to these organizations to build these apps that could be reused. Now, it was successful in that we got a number of apps, including one that was built locally, specifically for use in our convention center. It's kind of a wayfinding app with Apple's technology that theoretically could be repurposed in other places. This is all very, very new. We're talking from the last couple of months, so the long-term impact of it we've not really seen, but it certainly presents a model that could be used moving forward. And during the design phase of it, it was entirely designed to be something that could be replicated elsewhere versus something that would only work for us. Obviously, procurement laws are different everywhere, but I think the general idea is very sound.
Great, thank you. So one last question for all of you. I know when I first asked about how and if you've been collaborating with one another among governments, what have been specifically the challenges you faced in either procurement independently or procuring collectively as well? Yeah?
So the problem that we are currently facing in Houston is that the procurement teams are separated into departments, and the departments dictate the way that the RFP needs to be written, that the way the process almost needs to go. And I feel like even though procurement is a centralized function, it doesn't feel like it has the power to say, hey, department, you're not running the show, we are, so let me tell you how this procurement is supposed to happen. And so we've tried to sit everybody at a table and say, hey, let's come up with one process, one document, and you just can't get people to agree. That's the big challenge that we face in Houston.
And could you give an example of the types of things that people might disagree on?
So I haven't really been in a lot of those meetings, but off the top of my head, I've heard examples of, specifications for software or things like that. Going back to some of the things that were said thus far, right to outcomes and not, that's so specific. That's an example. Another example is what contract vehicle to use for a
Yep. I'm, yeah, unsurprised. Yeah?
Oh,
Yeah, you. Oh, no? Okay, here.
so last year we implemented a new e-procurement system. And one of the things first I want to say, I'm very interested. I came in, every time I've come into a procurement discussion, it's something different than what I was expecting. Because I expected everything to be, oh, let's talk about e-procurement or something like that. And it's always something completely, different. So I think that's very interesting. But we implemented an e-procurement system in Hawaii. And we sort of tried to figure out what the right problem space was to solve, because procurement can be this huge beast, and it can be something that's pretty well defined. And so the thing I think that really is hard about procurement, and why, and if I get the sort of sense from everybody here, the frustration is that you can't really leverage teams like Code for America or even small development teams that want to do something for you, because of the whole process of making like an RFX, an RFQ, or an RFI. You have to put all that work in ahead of time, which is really part of the process that you'd use if you were using like a brigade or something like that to do something. And so the thing that's really broken is just that the whole concept of a request for whatever, and that there needs to be some way to say, we want to do a collaborative request. We want to use a team to help us get to it. And the only way to do that is you split up into different phases, and it becomes really unwieldy as far as, oh, we're going to do the discovery phase, and we're going to do this. It makes it really difficult. But the problem, the e-procurement part is the easy part. Publishing, awarding, getting paid, being the service. It's the part that's the hardest part is how are you going to actually request them. Right? And are there is anybody doing like a collaborative request for services that's not an RFQ or an FX or something like that?
When you say that, you mean collaborative with other cities, like sort of.
No. What I mean is.
Sorry, I was late, by the way, gang. I was trapped on a train.
Sort of agile. Like if you're going to do an agile development, you don't come up with a spec. You're doing iterations and you're changing it along the way. There is I don't know of any like request for anything, service, that will allow you to do that.
Right.
And that's really the specific problem, is that there's no way that nobody understands how to give everybody a fair shake on doing something when that thing hasn't been well defined yet.
Mm-hmm.
And that seems like to be the problem everybody's facing. If we want to bring in these really smart people, and they're going to solve some problems for us, and we're not even sure what problems they're going to solve, but they're going to come in and do it. Oh, and they're not even going to charge you. So, and still they're like, we don't know how. We don't have any vehicle to do that.
Is that a common experience with the other folks that are working in government? And that's certainly been my experience working with. Hi, everybody. I'm Lane. Oh, right. Sorry. Microphone, so that this can get recorded for posterity. So yeah, this is actually a good lead-in to. Fortunately, I was late and I was on a train, but I was keeping up with the answers to the questions thanks to the magic of Google Drive and collaborative editing. So I think I'm caught up on where we are. So the goal of this morning is to sort of start to. One of the things we'd like to do at Code for America is actually start to answer that question. I feel like one of the roles that we can play, especially as part of this new companies team that Dharmishta and I are 2 of 3 people on, which is focused on how do we sort of help both help make it easier for startups to sell to cities, companies to sell to cities generally, but startups specifically, because that starts to get to some of the problems that you were citing. But also, to what extent can we start working with cities to help make it easier for them to buy? And one of the questions we're asking right now, one of the questions that I have for this audience generally is, what could we be doing to help with that, right? We have a sort of a third-party role in the ecosystem in which we don't have any sort of financial stake in the outcome. We just have a desire for the marketplace to work more efficiently. And I think I have a personal desire for cities just to spend less on technology generally. So the genesis of this project, which we'll show you in just a second, which is called the Open Procurement Project. One of the reasons, we're very early stages with it and just designing sort of the very first part of it. And one of my goals is, in a kind of an agile fashion, to look to cities in particular, startups as well, but cities in particular, for feedback on what would be most valuable as we start to work this project. For those of you who sort of saw the conversation that we had on stage yesterday about procurement, one of the questions that I sort of pointedly asked the panel, because I was genuinely curious, and also because I sort of thought I knew what they would say, was what they had seen in terms of cities collaborating, or what was effective for cities collaborating around procurement, and the answer that they came back with was basically no. That doesn't really happen much, and a lot of that is because every city is sort of a special, unique snowflake, and I think that is absolutely true. And I also think, though, that there's an opportunity to look for places where we can actually, make things more efficient. I think the point that you're making, sorry, was it Russell? So I think, Russell, the point you're making is a great example, right? There are some things, just like what is language that we can use around agile development that we can start to put into RFPs, that we can start to put into the contracts that we're writing? How can we start to standardize on that language and sort of share what we figured out works or doesn't work with each other as we start to put that together? I don't know if any of you saw the TechFAR document that came out at the federal level recently. This is Jen, our executive director, when this is one of the projects that she worked on for the federal government, and she basically did two projects. One was getting the USDS launched, which is cool, and the other one was actually trying to make Agile more relevant to the way that the federal government operates. And then since it's the federal government, there's like a 400-page document about Agile, but which, is charming. But it's worth, it's not quite 400 pages, but it's worth, we're actually worth taking the time to go through, because when we were looking at it, we were like, oh, there's some really terrific language in here, because they are trying to explain how can you insert into procurement a process, how can you start to describe in language that makes sense in the procurement process an outcome that isn't overly specified, right? How can you start to explain using standardized language, what does it mean to do sprints, and what does it mean to do customer discovery, and what does it mean to not necessarily define all the outcomes before you get going? Potentially even, what does it mean to put together a project in which the whole point of the project is to figure out whether or not you should be doing the project at all, which I think would actually probably be something that could potentially save governments at all scale a whole lot of money. And this is, again, something in the sort of commercial startup world you see all the time, especially in the agile world. There's, and in the land of customer discovery, there's all sorts of processes and structures that we can start to take from, that we can start to learn from, that are very specifically about how do we figure out whether or not this is even a good idea to do at all. All of which is kind of an intro to our first stab at this. And my hope today is that we can call it beta. I would probably call it alpha. If there was a Greek letter before alpha, I would use that one. One of our hopes at Code for America is that we can start to just be a clearinghouse, essentially, for that kind of language. For those places where we do sort of determine that it makes sense for cities to be actively sort of learning and sharing with each other in these areas where we all know that we're consistently having the same problem. And so we're currently calling it the Open Procurement Project, but I'm really open to better names than that. It's a little funny because you can make up rap songs about it, but otherwise it's just, I don't know. So anyway, we'll start with that. I'm open to new. That's how alpha we are. I'd love a different title. Feel free to suggest one. So the idea behind the Open Procurement Project is actually, can you pull up the explainer one? Thanks, Dharmishta. So, there it is in the first sentence, the Open Procurement Standards Project. We dropped standards. I was like, 3 words. Aims to develop a trusted open source repository of template documents for cities to procure technology services. So this isn't something that we're developing on our own. This is actually something that we want to develop with cities. And for the first one, the one that we'll sort of share out with everybody here today, so that you, if you're interested, can comment or make suggestions or whatever it might be. The first one we're doing is actually, we're interested in taking on some of the larger challenges around language around Agile and language around SaaS, but we don't want to do this if we're not working with cities. because it's not the sort of thing that we think that we can do outside of the context of an actual city, an actual problem. So for this first one, we actually worked with two different firms to put it together. One was Kieran Jane, who was on stage with me yesterday from the city of Oakland. And this is actually based very specifically on a project that we're working on with them right now. And the other one was a lawyer named Tim Huang, who was operating from sort of outside of the city perspective. We basically had one lawyer on each side. And the goal of this project was to write three different documents to work together. The first was an RFP for a particular set of services. The second was the contract that would be used to award that project to the firm or firms that was chosen based on the RFP. And then the third, which is you're looking at the beginning of now, was sort of what we think of as like a plain text explainer for both the RFP, but particularly for the contract, which is intended to be an actual contract that cities can use, download and use as a baseline. Both the RFP and the contract are used and intended to be used as something other cities can use, download, and use as a baseline. But a lot of that language can be obtuse, and especially in the legal side of things. And so one of the goals with the explainer was just to, where appropriate, put that into a context that would make sense to people so that the document could function for the people that were using it, not just as like the actual language that could go into the RFP or could go into the contract, but also could be used as sort of a pedagogic tool, right? If you're trying to sell this idea internally, if you're trying to figure out how to explain it in a different context, we wanted to provide language for that as well. So our hope is that we're going to be able to do a bunch of different types of these, and each of them is intended to get towards to sort of serve not a particular type of technology, but a particular problem, right? So really having this idea of like we want to have an outcome orientation. And yet, again, unlike, say, what Sasha does, where it's very much about the problem, and he's creating a Sasha, who was on stage from City Mart yesterday, where he was talking about, like, how do we build sort of an entirely different process that is very problem-oriented. In this case, what we're trying to do is something a little simpler, which is say, how do we work within the existing process, but still move towards something that is based more on a problem and move towards something that is based more on an outcome orientation. So for this first one, we actually did it around a very specific problem that cities get into a lot of the time, in my experience talking and working with them, which is what I've sort of taken to calling the 2 to 5 year website redesign cycle. And then there was lots of head nodding. I've asked around a lot. It's 2 on the good side and 5 on the bad side. And we are actually engaged in a project right now that we're calling the Digital Front Door, which some of you may be familiar with Oakland, and the goal there is really specifically to try and move Oakland from, in their case, they're on, I think, a 4-year redesign cycle, right? And that's, the way the cycle normally works is put together an RFP for the whole shebang, farm it out to usually one contractor. They go away and work on it for 12 months. They come back with it, they implement it or half implement it, and then you get someone else to fully implement it. By then it's been, 12 to 18 months on the good side, 24 months on the bad side. The site is usually out of date. It often doesn't necessarily, because it's been developed so outside of the role of the city and the people who work within it. It's often not really attuned, let's say, to the goals that people have either internally or externally. And everybody does what everyone does in that situation, which is figures out how to sort of work around it, come up with smart hacks, deal with it, don't deal with it as appropriate. And everybody sort of puts up with that until such time as they can no longer do that, and then the process starts over. So we had this long conversation with Oakland in which we were like, and to be clear, that is no stretch of the imagination a problem that is specific to cities. It's just that I think we have an opportunity. It certainly happens in the commercial world, but I think that we have a real opportunity in this case to see if we can change that. So the Digital Front Door project, which was the genesis of the Open Procurement project, was, we sat down with Oakland. We'd had a really successful experience with Oakland building Record Track, which is the tool that came out of their fellowship year in 2013. And the city, and particularly the communications team that we worked with, was very, very bought in. That's good. I'm totally into this. Feel free. You could do a laugh track too. You could harass me. I should say, I know I'm up here monologuing a little bit, but feel free to interrupt with questions or ideas or to heckle. So we sat down with that team, and they basically said, what else might we be able to do together, given that Record Track was a successful project, given that like the ideas around agile development, around sort of lean methodology, that there's a lot of buy-in in different parts of the city for that. What can we do next? And they kind of came back and they said, well, what if we tried to take on the website, because it's fairly core, almost a platform for everything else that needs to happen. I should say also we were obviously very inspired in this conversation by what GDS did with gov.uk, because who isn't inspired by that? And so also trying to ask the question, like, how could we do that at the city level? So the sort of framework for the Digital Front Door project, which I won't go too into, although I'm happy to speak with you more about it later if you're interested, is, we asked the question, what if the city, the frame of it is, what if the city website was not about the city? What if the city website was the city, right? What if the assumption was a digital first assumption in which we as a city are trying to figure out how to move all of the services that we can move online, create a structure in which it's understood internally that that is what we're trying to do, and so that there is an assumption that every service needs to move on, that it needs to move on in sort of a progressive order, but that as new services are developed by the city, or new ideas for services are developed by the city, that it's understood that those also should be thought of as an online first, offline second kind of thing. So that's a tall order, and not, we're just going to be working with them on it for a year, and it's not anything we expect to necessarily get finished, but I think it's an important conversation to be having, and grateful to Oakland for having that with us. So this kind of came out of, that obviously reaches back into a bunch of different things, right? It's about the website, so obviously we're touching on IT. We're going to be touching on every single department that works with technology, which is every single department when you're thinking about putting all of your services online. It's going to reach into policy issues. It's going to reach into all sorts, it's basically going to touch every aspect of the city, and we wanted, including procurement, and we wanted to acknowledge that. So this project came out of that. The very first one of these, the very first set of RFP and contract documents that we put together was for a website redesign. And I think this is where we sort of started working on solving the problem of how do you work within the existing system but create more of a problem orientation. So what we did is we started with a narrative, and the narrative was the one that I just shared with you, about how do we go from, if we want to start thinking about the website as, let's say, the website is a form of City Hall, right? The place where the vast majority of citizens, if they do not now, will soon interact, right? Especially if you're thinking about it from a mobile perspective, right? Because from a mobile perspective, when it comes to sort of landline technology, it is still only going to reach into some of your neighborhoods. Mobile actually, reaches a far greater degree of your constituency, I guess you could say. So the opportunity to sort of, pay your parking ticket at 3 a.m. sitting in bed, or apply for a small business license at 3 a.m., from bed in your pajamas, that's, potentially available to a much greater set of people than it would be on just desktop computers. So we looked at that and we said, okay, if we're going to think about the website as City Hall, so the current structure basically means that every 2 to 5 years we raise City Hall, knock it down, and then start building it again. Why don't we use that metaphor and think about it a little differently? Why don't we think about how are we going to use this to establish a foundation on top of which other things can get built, other things can get moved, but no one would think every 5 years we got to knock this thing down and start over, right? That would be crazy. That was sort of the frame we wanted to use to change this process. So within that, what we did is we said, okay, what has to change internally in order for this to happen? And again, this is, the end result of this is to get to RFPs, it's to get to contracts, it's to be able to work through this process. But in order to get there, we were like, here are the series of conversations we feel like we need to have. What doesn't work internally right now? And one of the challenges is that a lot of the way that the website is currently run and managed is handled in the IT department in the city of Oakland. I imagine that's probably true for at least some of you. One of the things that was most interesting to us as we started having that conversation is we realized that nobody liked that, right? That IT, at least in Oakland, is not particularly enamored of running that particular aspect of the content management system. While they do love the content management system, in their case it's Oracle, they don't necessarily enjoy, let's say, being the bottleneck for a lot of the different departments. And of course, that means that they figured out different hacks and workarounds. There's one particular person, his name is Titus, he is awesome, in the IT department who literally everyone in the city of Oakland has to go to whenever they have a problem. Titus is struggling under the weight of never being able to go on vacation, and as is his wife. So all of these things, over time, while everybody understands, I sort of make these jokes, they're entirely true, but it's part of the reason that as we started having these conversations and unpacking it with the city, talking to IT, talking to the different teams, we recognize there are actually some structural problems here that are, both causing people challenges in terms of the way that their job operates and also causing challenges in terms of thinking about how the city could scale. So the conversation we're having with them now is, and part of what this is about is how do we peel off an appropriate chunk of that? We still need to work with all of the internal systems. We still need to work with Oracle's document management system, and we're absolutely going to do that. But what part of this website could be peeled off and replaced by other lighter weight tools? And what would be necessary to support that? So the conversation again becomes about, before we've even gone to the RFP process, we're talking about what does the team look like internally that's going to manage this, right? And how is that team going to be structured? Where is that team going to sit? And I'm not saying we have answers to any of these questions yet, although we're starting to work on it with them. But we recognize that those are answers that need to happen, right? The very first thing you realize when you say the website is going to be the city, it's going to be an aspect of the site that is about digital service delivery. We're going to try and adopt a digital first stance in the way that we think about things is, okay, well, we probably need a team internally to manage that. So the conversations about where that's going to happen and how that's going to happen are going to be one thing for Oakland, and I suspect, much as is the case in the commercial world, the answers will be slightly different for every city because every city is slightly different. But again, that baseline thing, which is we need to build a team that is focused specifically on this, and that can work both with IT on the back end and with all of these different departments on the front end in a somewhat consultative fashion through both tools and services to maintain this system is very important. Yes, Greg?
Is there a shorter URL link to this particular document?
Oh, well, I'll send out. I will send out links to everybody afterwards. Be collecting cards and email addresses because I am not going to put this thing live without the input of every single person in this room.
Have you reached out to NIGP or any of the national procurement? Having procurement professionals look at it.
Yep.
And at least just hear what their complaints might be with it.
Oh yeah, absolutely. So we haven't actually done that yet. We've started those conversations. The sort of order of operations. I'm really taking the long view on this and really trying to recognize that our role in this one is primarily as convener. We started with city lawyers, and we'd like to, by the end of it, have the eyes of everybody in the city who's involved in it. Obviously there are going to be some places where we are going to break with convention, but at least I'd like that to be understood. But anyway, step one is talk to people who are actually inside cities, the kinds of people who might actually have to do this project, get their input and their buy-in, get that document to a place where we're comfortable, and then broaden it out to, for example, procurement professionals and some of the other places that we need to go.
Just to comment, I think you're on the right track. I like the idea of a model, procurement document. I really think it'd be helpful to have case studies. People, things that, they've actually done it. They post their documents. You can look at it. This feels a little too much like, here, we're going to tell you how to do it.
Right.
Who's done it? And let us, look at different examples, and we can help customize that for our own users.
Yeah, I totally hear you. We're in a little bit of a chicken and an egg thing. And I really if there are aspects of this that come across as telling, I really, really would like your help in removing that, whether it's language or framing or context, because it was very, very important to us that we start with the city of Oakland, and that we worked with the city of Oakland to put this together, and that all of the documents that we are creating are going to get used by the city of Oakland in the process. That's the genesis for all of these. And I really, I want to make sure that doesn't happen. And with Oakland, we will absolutely try and put together case studies. San Diego has actually grabbed some of this and has already started working with it. Mostly because one of them sat next to Mike, our CTO, or one of the people on the project sat next to Mike, our CTO, on an airplane, kind of randomly, on the way to a GIS conference. But we're working on that, or we would like to get to that as quickly as possible.
Like what this gentleman said about
Austin, Texas, my hometown. Well, one of them. So, woo, Austin. Words. Okay.
What I'm finding is I came from industries, finding it as a very different environment inside cities. That listening to a lot of discussions from non-city folks here is that, and I'm not being cynical when I say this, there's a lack of understanding of really how cities are not risk takers and businesses are, and that difference is at the crux of sometimes not getting things done. And so there's education that needs, in my opinion, needs to be done on both sides. And one of them here, we can get a number of standards and documents. You'll be yet another document that yet another bunch of city employees will have to read and say, why is this one better than that one? What I'm finding is important is improving the decision-making process within the city. Where budgets, how high up the organization does a budget, a spending request have to go? Where can we get decision points changed? And these are things that not necessarily can be done by saying, here's coding and procurement standards. This is a way of it's something to encourage a government to say, can we move decision making, but spending authority lower than government? Can we take committees away? And a lot of the times these are there in my short experience is because people are so averse to taking risks for good reasons and what's become bad reasons, but for originally good reasons. That the process for getting these things out, even if you have to go through the paperwork, is onerous, slow, and the accountability doesn't exist in some of these places. So I'd like to see this, but I'd like to see discussion of understanding of when you have a very risk-averse culture, and good or bad that comes with that. How do you get decisions made quickly? And having another document to say, here's how it's better. And I've heard from folks from outside government say, it just makes sense. It's efficient. It's fast. It's a better way of doing things. You're right. But governments aren't set up to be efficient. They aren't set up to be fast. They're not set up. And they set up to take risks, right? And when we understand that and embrace it as a goodness rather than something just odd, although it's kind of devolved into something really, really bad, then I think we can make some more progress. We can take documents like this, but we have to figure out a way to make decisions faster. And in the case of the city government, they really care about ethically, whether we believe it or not, ethically. Get that done fast, we can get a lot of this started. But I'd like to see case studies.
Does that resonate with folks in the room?
I was going to say, I think it depends. I think that goes back to one of the themes that I've been hearing throughout the conference is this cultural shift that needs to happen, and how do you build the trust? So I had an interesting conversation yesterday in one of the groups about starting it with performance improvement or doing some sort of KPIs and then building your trust on that, and then moving to open data and kind of doing this sequential order of trust, if you will. I think that is important to get to a culture where they're willing to take risks, because it's not like there are no cities out there that take risks, right? Like, I mean, Chicago is a really good example of open data and pushing forward.
Chicago
and
has
taking
Rahm Emanuel as its mayor.
a risk.
It's a strong mayor government.
Right, and he's involved, so I agree. But I think that while it's true to say that there are people that are risk averse in government, I think there are just the same amount of people that are not, but are being pressed by the system that is in place.
I'll look at that. When I say this process, the policies in place make people risk averse, but you meet the individuals and they want to do good.
Yeah, that's actually been my experience as well. Alyssa?
Hi, I'm Melissa, Emilio Network, former public servant. To me, it sounds like there's a couple things at play. One of them is kind of expediting the procurement process so that it's easier for smaller companies to navigate. And then the other one is procuring better services, right? And so it seems like you're getting at that with this standard, but those two things might be separate, because procuring horrible services quickly is not what you want to do. And you want to get the right services that practice certain types of methodology in the door. So I think it might be helpful to think about those two goals.
That makes sense, and I think actually looking at sort of on the one hand, yes, I can see sort of breaking those out in terms of the description. Although I think at the end of the day, you have to, I think for the purposes of the narrative of this, I think those actually need to be conflated.
From
Yep.
I totally agree with what Ted was saying, which is
Yep, that's great. Thank you. Got about 5 minutes. Any more comments? Greg?
So it resonated a lot with me on the first day, the GDS observation of change the institution, change the language. At the same time, I think that there's a lot about, I think to your point, we have to speak the language that's in place, often because it's backed by policies that are written into law. So even if people want to change it, they can't necessarily change it without violating something that is statute or a rule. And so we have to, while we're developing new language, we have to be capable of speaking language that is understood. To that end, I think it is possible for Code for America or other things to provide assets to everybody else that help them speak that language, right? Because there's a bunch of check boxes, there's a bunch of wordsmithing that if you're applying to an RFP, is pretty standard across the different RFPs that we apply to. Right. So there's a sense of we could tackle this on more than one front. You know, there's the changing of it, but it's also for the things that are in place, being able to rise up to that institutional challenge and give us and give people in this room and the startups a template that they can follow to apply for things as they exist as well, even while we're trying to change the template to make it easier.
So I'm going to go in the order of hands. David in the back there.
Yeah, I feel like I started DVDs. I've been involved with America for a long time, but I also have a startup, and I do feel like I want to be careful about who's getting served in what ways. Like the comments from the cities really do resonate with me, and I can see it from both ways. So I buy cities, but I also have a startup, and I can tell you, and you're in a startup land, your first 10 contracts are like the most painful thing that you ever need to go through, because it's not just because like you're learning it all, but you're so desperate for money that you're like, the fact that I have to wait 8 months is like a sales cycle that's so unacceptably long I can't manage it. So we're now in 100 cities, and I'm like, 8 months, like I now have the cash flow where I'm like, I can handle 8 months. And in fact, I really like the RFP process because we have some competitors and most of them are awful. And whenever there's an RFP, we always win. And so I'm like, the RFP is actually doing, well, I mean, it may be selfishly, but actually like legitimately believe the RFP is doing the right thing and that it is weeding out terrible actors. And so I feel like the brigades really want to get rid of the RFPs or want to hack the process because they want, you know, their experiment to be able to happen. But it's actually not that sustainable, whatever the experiment's going to be. So for me, I want to make sure that we're actually arguing for the same thing. So whoever's at the comment of like, the RFP ensures that the quality gets through, is like, that's a wonderful comment that can't be lost. There's a reason why it exists. And so I think for me, the question is not how do we change the process so that everybody can win, but how do we actually accept that there are actually very different aims here? And that how do we fix the RFP process so that legitimate players going through may actually not require as much work as we think. But if we're trying to do speed and experimentation, we may actually be looking for completely different approaches here. And I would love to see more IT groups have budget where it says, you can actually go blow this money on stuff where it's completely outside the RFP process. You gotta do something that's truly experimental, but we're willing to take it off, like take the gloves off because you are gonna fund that startup for which they can't afford to wait 8 months. But let's not treat that as necessarily as an RFP problem.
As we kind of tack on to everything that's said so far, I appreciate there's obviously a need to share kind of best practices in procurement and expressing it through example documents makes sense. I like the idea. I love the idea. The tech bar is the genius of the federal government's tech bar is that it describes an approach where you basically can hijack the existing procurement language in order to kind of coerce it into doing agile development, which is great. And there's for a lot of reasons you want to focus on different things the government can do in order to permit this forward. I think one area to explore would be teaching folks like David's competitors how to better express themselves through the through the RFP process, right? Because we can't transform every city's procurement language, and certainly not even in the next 10 years would we expect the 80,000 executive offices to be able to express themselves the way that we want. So I think it's just as important to help bootstrap startups, and even like mid-sized companies have a hard time with this, helping them better understand the procurement process and to better express like an agile approach to a solution and do it in the context of kind of the existing warring hostile procurement language.
So I think we've got time for one more comment.
Just a question of thinking about who gains from the efficiencies, right? Because then you say you may be shortening times for people who can't afford to do 8 months. But if you standardize, does that mean the big players who only think it's worth playing in the big cities can now go, well, we can shoot all these out and we can hit 100,000 cities. Therefore, they can scale much faster than the small players.
Yep.
Right? And I've seen this happen in a bunch of non-related projects where the technology actually makes it easier for big players and makes it harder, or constricts the space for smaller players.
Right. So I hear that, and I sort of recognize that as in part in response to David. And I guess just the last thing I want to say about this project is I am not necessarily looking to make this process more efficient. I'm just looking to make this process have better outcomes. I don't know that efficiency is necessarily a goal. I actually think when we think about stepping back from the specific implementation of the procurement process in many cities, right now I think one of the things we have to do is ask, what are the parts that can sort of safely be removed or changed or modified, and which are the ones that are really important and that we need to keep. And I'm sort of currently of the opinion that that the pace of the process or the speed of the process is not necessarily something that needs to change, which doesn't mean that we can't carve out spaces to acknowledge that there absolutely are other approaches or more nuanced approaches that treat different kinds of technologies in a different way. So I'm happy to stick around for questions afterwards. If you're, sorry, I should wrap up before they start yelling at me. Some more continue yelling at me since I was late. Some frantic text messages. So we will send out some short URLs to all 3 of these documents because I would love your feedback on them. We're also hoping to start on another one soon that is just a generalized contract for sort of a SaaS, procuring a SaaS application. And then beyond just comments and responses to this, I'm also interested, we would like to continue doing this down the line into next year once we get past those 2. And if you have ideas about other areas that this type of approach would be valuable and that we could work on with you, be really interested in having that conversation. So if we could just you can either come up and write your email address here or just give us a card and I'll make sure that we get it out to you. I want to thank everybody for coming and working on this with us.